And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Steve Hampton, who will present Birds and Climate Change with a special focus on the Pacific Northwest. Although a frequent visitor to the Puget Sound region for many years, Steve recently retired to Port Townsend after a 25-year career with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Those of you who subscribe to Tweeters will likely recognize his name because of his interesting posts on the listserv. He now serves as Conservation Chair and Christmas Bird Count Compiler for Admiralty Audubon, among other contributions to the birding community. For tonight's program, Steve has delved deeply into one of his special interests, avian responses to climate change. In December 2022, he published a summary of his findings on this important topic in the American Bird Association publication Birding. Tonight, he will share his results, again, with a special focus on the Pacific Northwest. And now I invite you to the microphone, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen here. Beginning. Okay. Okay, can you all see a masked booby?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to WOS and especially Vicki and Elaine. I'm coming to you all from Pojoaque Pueblo, New Mexico, in an Airbnb. And if we have internet problems, we have a plan B, so don't go away. We can pivot to an alternative backup plan if need be. But we're gonna proceed forward. And again, thanks to Elaine and Vicki. You all have no idea how much planning they put into this, and they put in quite a bit. Okay, birds and climate change. And I'm going to focus on the Pacific Northwest. This is a masked booby, the one last summer that was riding on a barge. The photo was taken by Mark Stolmeyer, who is the captain of one of the orca watching boats. He was notified by, I think, Alex Pasha, and they didn't have orcas to look at, so they went by this boat, and I saw them in a distance, and that's the most I saw of the booby was boats in a heat mirage. But it's significant because masked booby is from the Galapagos, not masked booby, I'm sorry, Nazca booby. I've been saying masked booby. This is a Nazca booby, which is separate now from masked. From the Galapagos, first US record was in 2013 in California. They're now so common in California that they've been taken off the review list. And they're becoming almost annual now in the Salish Sea, which is kind of mind-blowing. But it is otherwise a tropical seabird. A little background on my birding to Washington. In Port Townsend, we're careful not to say we retired and moved to Port Townsend without saying also that we're contributing in some way. So my wife is working, and she's actually from Tacoma originally. So I've been coming up to Tacoma for 30 years or more. And I found this bird, this slaty-backed gull, at a time when there were very few records, and I called Dennis Paulson because we have a mutual friend, Michael Perrone, and Dennis said, "Yeah, call this woman named Ruth Sullivan, and she has a camera," because back then very few people had cameras. And then I met Ruth and Patrick, and told my wife about them, and my wife instantly, by my description of Ruth and Patrick, instantly recognized that she was Patrick's babysitter when she was in junior high. So my connection to Ruth and Patrick goes back through my wife to babysitting, and I ended up going birding with them off and on through the years. I was going to say I'm coming to you from Katai, Port Townsend, but I'm coming to you actually not from the ancestral territory of the Pojoaque Pueblo, but from the current and ancestral territory of Pojoaque Pueblo, because a lot of the pueblos here all the pueblos here in New Mexico are not just ancestral, they're lived in. But as far as the land acknowledgement goes, I want to add one more thing, because I'm a Cherokee citizen, and I've been I'm here for I was here for the powwow, a big powwow in Albuquerque, and visiting these pueblos. And a common concept, if you've ever read Braiding Sweetgrass, is that indigenous peoples very much believe that humans are ecologically potentially more like frogs in a boiling pot, that we don't notice things changing around us, but wildlife does. And so we need to learn from wildlife. And that's definitely the theme of my talk here, is that we need to pay attention to what's happening around us. A lot of people don't notice what's happening, but the birds have changed, and if we pay attention to them, they can tell us a lot. So I'm going to move on. This has already been mentioned about me. There's links posted by Elaine about the Birds and Climate Change Facebook group and the Cottonwood Post. And I'll actually have some of this stuff I've presented there as well. So here's the outline. I'm going to talk a brief history of climate change in birds. And by history, I mean going back 60 million years. A little bit about predictions, and then I'm going to spend most of my time on number 3. What are we actually seeing so far? And there's 4 main categories. There's changes in timing. There's evolution in real time, northward range shifts, and ecological cascades. And I'm going to talk about all 4 of those. And just kind of a summary on what the literature is right now, because I do try and track that, and I post summaries of that at the Birds and Climate Change website. I have got a document that has the abstracts, highlighted abstracts from as many papers as I could get my hands on. So originally, all the literature was predictions and models about the future. Well, we're past that now. The data is in, and we see changes are happening, so we don't need to do predictions anymore. So a lot of the research has been on phenology, which is timing. Are birds migrating earlier? Are they laying their eggs earlier? That's a huge focus of research. And in the last few years, we're actually beginning to see people talking about the range shifts. And the birds that are shifting are not necessarily the migratory birds, they're the resident birds that are shifting more. But these papers are disappointing to bird watchers because they usually aggregate all the species and they don't tell you which species are moving. But now we have new information on that, so I'll share that. And there's an Anna's hummingbird, which we'll talk a little bit more about too. So I want to go back in time and shout out to Kim Adelson. I absolutely love her talks. And so she talks about the fact that there were birds before the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. These were pre-asteroid or meteorite birds. And they were not just giant birds, but small birds that look a lot like our birds today. So here's a bird from, I don't know, before 66 million years ago, and a black-crowned Titira, and they look pretty similar to me. And since then, since Kim Adelson's talks, I think, a book has come out, Birds of the Mesozoic, which is the time period before the meteor strike that killed the dinosaurs. So these are birds that lived with dinosaurs, or I should say these birds were a family of dinosaurs. I don't have this book, but I really want to get it. So let's just go back in time. The timeline's on the bottom. 66 million years ago is the meteor strike. And that killed all of these birds that look like, and the dinosaurs. In fact, it killed all the non-bird dinosaurs, and it killed all the bird dinosaurs except for the ancestors of ducks and chickens, and maybe tinamous, which are like chickens. And as a chicken keeper myself, you know, I can imagine, I guess, that they would survive. They're not smart, but they are survivors. So since then, birds re-evolved into all of these different families that we know today. And most notably, 55 million years ago, there's a temperature spike. That steep red line that goes up to the top of the graph is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which was a big climate warming event. It caused mass extinctions. This is an illustration of inside the Arctic Circle, which looked pretty tropical. And so then that's what happened then. And if you look at this is a new graph I just got recently, and I'm going to need to scoot my chat window out of the way so I can see the right-hand side here. So here's CO2 levels is the black line, and temperatures are the blue and red lines. They track each other pretty closely, and you can see where we are right now. And so my point here of showing this is the speed of change. And so the change right now is about 1 degree Celsius in about 100 years. And let's compare that to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. How do I gotta click back here. There we go. Okay. So the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum is the big gray diagonal line. That was a 5 degrees Celsius temperature increase over 5,000 years. So that it took 5,000 years. That spike was a 5,000 year long spike, which means if you were living through that, you would not have noticed it. Many generations of birds and other animals lived and died and never even know that they were living through a temperature spike because it was so gradual. And there's some other extinction event spikes that I've graphed also there. And our current spike is the red line. And there's different scenarios under the climate change protocol, but basically, it's the Paleocene-Eocene one's 1 degree Celsius per 1,000 years. Our current spike is per 100 years or faster. We have had some other climate freezes and ups and downs since then. Probably one that people may be somewhat cognizant of is that we had some ice ages. My home in Port Townsend would have been under how many feet of ice? Is that really right? 4,000? I think that's 4,000 feet of ice. And this was only 20,000 years ago, and then it melted. And so the temperature increased 8 degrees Celsius in 7,000 years. So that's still 1 degree Celsius per 1,000 years. And so our current rate is 10 times faster. So that's the important thing, is that things are happening rapidly. This is just another repeat of that. I should have probably taken this out because the other graph was better. But right now we're experiencing 1 degree Celsius per 100 years. So if this is the Arctic to come, if this is the way we're headed, and I'm not necessarily saying we are, but this type of thing is in motion. The question is, can the trees and animals get there? There's no question birds can fly. Birds are incredibly mobile, most birds. And but they do need to eat. And so they're typically dependent on the ecosystem around them. So if the trees can't get there, then that doesn't matter. The birds would have nowhere to go. So that's an important thing to think about as we think about rapid climate change, is not how fast the birds can fly, but how fast the oak trees can fly. So let's talk a little bit about the predictions that have been out there. This is a red-shouldered hawk, another species that's increasing north. I photographed this in Jefferson County in January. Not really a surprise. In fact, there were 2 different ones in the county in January. So the best website for looking at predictions is National Audubon. if you type in a bird, you can scroll down and it pulls up these colorful maps that shows their predictions under 6 scenarios. They have summer and winter, and then they have 1.5, 2.0, and 3 degrees Celsius increase. And the graphs mean in the red areas is where they will disappear, in the blue areas where they will increase, and the yellow areas is where they'll kind of maintain their range. And the graphs generally look like this: red in the south, blue in the north. We already know that there are willow trees 10, 15 feet tall growing on the north slope of Alaska. And so the yellow warblers will probably follow them pretty closely. Here's an example. I've zoomed in. So these maps are, somewhat interactive. You can zoom in. So here's their predictions for white-crowned sparrows in the summer under just 1.5 Celsius, which is almost where we're at. And they predict that they will not be nesting in Puget Sound. And right now, certainly they are, at least in Port Townsend, they are singing all over town right now from rooftops, which is amusing. But this is the prediction. And again, some of Audubon's predictions have been probably overstated and some understated, but they are all worth looking at. And this is white-crowned sparrow in the winter, where we're going to get more of them in the winter because the idea is they're shifting north, so they're going to winter more north instead of going to California or somewhere. And I will show some Christmas bird count data where this is true. This is happening. So let's get to the real meat, which is what are we seeing so far? And I'm going to cover them in this order. Changes in timing, that's phenology, which I'm going to do mostly in one slide. Rapid evolution, which I also am going to talk about in probably just 1 or 2 slides. Northward range shifts, I'm going to spend most of my time on because that's where birders, I think, can notice things and where we play the biggest role in collecting data, because a lot of those papers actually rely on Christmas bird count, breeding bird survey, and eBird data. And then I'll wrap up by talking about ecological cascades. And the bird on the left is a Wilson's warbler, and the bird on the right is a juvenile spotted towhee. And that's there to remind us all to keep track of when you see the juveniles out, because the first time you see a juvenile tells you something about their nesting timing. It's hard for us all to go out and study when eggs are laid, when the eggs hatch, because we don't find the nest. But I do notice when the juveniles are out, and I make sure I note that in my eBird reports. So let's talk about phenology, timing. This is what everyone is studying. And the long story short is the information is pretty mixed. We have seen some issues, but not big things yet. So why this is important is because it turns out that to raise a nest of chicks requires a ridiculous amount of bugs. So here's chestnut-backed chickadees in my backyard in a nest box. And I'm told that they need at least 6,000 caterpillars to fledge these young. These are mostly moth caterpillars, and they mostly come from native trees, not from non-native trees. So that's where native trees become so important. But these moth caterpillars only come out at a certain time of year. So the poster child for this phenology research is the European pied flycatcher, which is a bird that is in Europe. It winters in Africa, and it migrates north to Europe to nest. And it times its nesting with the caterpillars. So here's my complicated diagram. So they nest in both oaks in the Netherlands and in mixed coniferous forests in Scandinavia. And the caterpillars come out during the spring. And in the oak forest, they have a very narrow window. But in the mixed coniferous forest, they have a broader window when there's a lot of caterpillars. So the European pied flycatchers have kind of evolved to hit the peak of the caterpillars, and this is when they're nesting and feeding their young. So what's happened with warming climates is a lot of trees and plants are flowering, and the insects are responding several weeks earlier, up to a month earlier in the further north you go. So I've scooted everything over proverbially a month. I don't have units down below, but imagine this is about 3 weeks to 4 weeks earlier now. So green is where caterpillars used to be, and orange is now with a warming climate. And so are the European pied flycatchers coming earlier to hit the new peak? And the answer is yes, but only about 2 days earlier or 1 day earlier. So they're not coming earlier enough. It hasn't really hurt them in the mixed coniferous forest. There's still a lot of caterpillars, but they are missing the peak badly in the oaks in the Netherlands. So there's about 90% decline of European pied flycatchers in the Netherlands. They're still doing pretty good in the birch pine forest in Scandinavia. There's a lot of concern that things will get worse and this will start affecting other species. Yeah, here's actually the data. They're laying their eggs 1.2 days earlier per 1 degree Celsius increase. And that clearly is not enough. So they're becoming, the term is ecologically mismatched. So of course, they're studying this now for all kinds of birds in North America as well. You could take a screenshot of this slide if you want. I'm not going to go through all of this, but the research is all over the map on this. It looks like a lot of our Canadian taiga boreal forest is like Scandinavia, that has kind of a broader range of caterpillars. Yeah, the data is all over the map. So this is just a concept that really is still being researched. We're going to move on to evolution. So during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, birds actually, I mean, obviously there were winners and losers, but it took so long, it took 5,000 years, that birds actually evolved through that. And because it was so tropical in the Arctic, a lot of species actually moved from the Americas to the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere and vice versa. So you had birds crossing from Europe and Asia and Africa to the Americas and vice versa. So the question is now, can birds evolve fast enough? And that's becoming a new question. I'm astounded that they can evolve at all in just 100 years or just 50 years. But there are some data sets out there that are like, I don't know how long they are. They're like 50, 60, 70-year data sets. The photo is unfortunately birds that hit windows in Chicago. Chicago window strikes. But they've collected these birds for decades and they've measured them. They've also looked at birds from research stations in the Amazon and Israel and Pennsylvania, and they're finding consistently that birds are getting smaller. And of the migrants especially are getting longer winged. So the idea here is that in hotter temperatures, in hotter climates, animals are smaller. This is Bergman's rule. And because they're dealing with the heat, then they have less muscle mass, so they can't flap their wings as much, so they grow longer wings. And we're actually seeing birds evolve this way just in the last 50 years or plus. They've looked, now there's some new papers out looking more closely at birds' need for water and for cooling temperatures and things like that. And in the Mojave Desert, they have concluded that smaller birds are doing better than larger birds. Larger birds are declining faster in areas where heat and access to water is an issue. So we're going to move on to our second to last topic, but the main topic is northward range shifts. And this is the one that is just so noticeable to me. And here's 3 common birds from my old home, Davis, California, that are now daily birds for me in Port Townsend. Well, no, the black phoebe's not quite daily yet. The scrub jay's daily. Anna's hummingbird is definitely daily. And we had our first 2 black phoebes in April for Jefferson County. And now every county in Western Washington has had black phoebe. And I would guess that they're only going to increase. They are lovely birds. These birds are generally not known as migratory birds. So it is the resident birds, which is interesting, are the ones that are really kind of stepping up, going north. And it looks like some of these species at least are keeping up with climate velocity, which is how fast temperatures are shifting north, which is 1 to 3 miles per year. That one line says, on average, bird ranges are shifting north 1 to 3 miles per year. The word average I've circled because there's a lot of what I would call typical uniquenesses between birds. And so some are moving north a lot and some are not moving at all. And we'll talk about that. So here's the exciting thing, and this has come out since my paper in birding, is eBird trends maps. If you go to eBird, don't hit My eBird, don't hit Explore, hit the Science tab, and then go to Trends. And these are remarkable maps. Each map is like 1,000 research papers. Each circle is about the size of a Christmas bird count circle. They're not that big, and they tell you how the birds have been increasing or decreasing since it's 2007 to 2019 is the time period. So a very short window, and yet they've deduced these trends. And if you hover over the dots, which I've done in this window, it tells you that in that Puyallup dot, lesser goldfinches are increasing 86% during that time period. And they're decreasing in the south, they're increasing in the north. This is a quote from Birds of Washington. There was a 1951 record, but essentially, they were labeled a very rare vagrant elsewhere in the state in 1974. And now you can find them in a lot of places. We haven't had one yet in Port Townsend, but we will. There was one in Squim last year. Thanks, Elaine, for posting that link. So these eBird trends maps either show summer or winter, and it doesn't seem like they're showing both. So for rough-legged hawk, they show winter. There's a paper that says that their winter distribution is shifting north 5 miles a year. And sure enough, they're all declining. There are some white circles. The white means they're holding their own. And the red means they're declining. I should say that the size of the circle refers to the abundance of birds. So if the circle is a big fat circle, that means there's still a lot of birds there. And then the shading, the darker the red or the darker the blue means the more it's increasing or decreasing. I looked at birds in the east. I put this in a blog post at the Cottonwood Post. It's remarkable. Birds are really showing a pretty consistent pattern of decreasing in the south and increasing in the north. This issue actually came up today on on Facebook, the eBird discussion group, some people were concerned that eBird is now labeling belted kingfisher in summer in the Florida Panhandle as a rare bird, a flagged species. I don't have the belted kingfisher map here, but it's like this. It's red in the south and blue in the north. I'm not really talking about seabirds too much, like the Nazca booby or water birds, but water birds moving north is a huge thing in the east. You may be cognizant of the limpkin explosion. So limpkin, I've always thought of as a Florida-only bird. And this is the eBird map from 2000 to 2015. There's a few records outside of Florida. I'm going to draw a line around them. So here's just 2022, just last year. That's where limpkins were. And it's missing the one in Minneapolis. And this year, it's only, gosh, even in April, there were already limpkins showing up in the Midwest. This to me is mind-boggling. There's a whole nother list of birds: white ibis, black-bellied whistling ducks. All of those listed there are experiencing similar northward movements. I saw the Eastern Seabird guy, Tom Johnson, posted that I think it's in New Jersey. There's a colony of the white ibises started nesting there a few years ago, and now the colony has over 400 nests. So this is a remarkable trend. So let's get back to the Pacific Northwest. Back to my thing about are humans frogs in a boiling pot. It's really interesting when I mentioned to people that you know, a few decades ago there were no hummingbirds in Washington in winter, and a lot of people don't even realize that. On the Port Townsend Christmas bird count in 2004, I think 2004, 2002, something like that, we had 0 hummingbirds, and now we have over 100. So here's Anna's hummingbirds on Christmas bird counts in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Yeah, this graph is a graph that looks a lot like not just other bird graphs, but it looks like graphs for other species. It looks like graphs for acres burned in California wildfires. It looks like all kinds of climate-related graphs. And they all tend to take off in the late 80s or mid 90s, and kind of in that range is when they start to go up. You see a little bubble there around 1982, 1984, and then it kind of goes back down again. That's something real, because I've seen that little swerve on some other species. That's when white-tailed kites were in Washington, was during that period, and then they didn't come back. But yeah, it's an interesting period. Maybe it was just good weather for Christmas bird counts then. I don't know. But I'll show you a few more here. Well, here's the trends map. And there they are. A lot of blue in the north and a lot of red in the south. So this kind of validates the trends map when I'm comparing it to the Christmas bird count data. And if you zoom in, you can see, well, so it maxes at 200%. I figured this out. It always maxes at 200% for the increase. Here's our spread of our California scrub jays. I made this graph to show that there was just one in the Okanagan Valley. Since I've made this graph, there's been one in that town north, and I don't even know how to pronounce this, Kelowna. There's a scrub jay there now, which is the northernmost scrub jay ever. And they're now really resident in Port Townsend. We had a big group of, I think, dispersing juveniles last September, and clearly some of them have stayed. Here's the map, the trends map. holding their own in California, still a lot of white, but there are a lot of little blue dots up in Washington. And some blue moving out into the Columbia Plateau. That's a thing too that's happening with a lot of birds. There's black phoebes, we've talked about, that's Oregon only. There's black phoebes having a hard time in the desert Southwest and moving up the coast. It'd be really interesting to know what insects these birds actually specialize on and what those insects depend on to get the full ecological story. Yeah, someone mentioned feeders and non-native plants. And yeah, that's true. That plays a huge role. When we think about range shifts, think about climbing a ladder. And birds need to eat, and those are the rungs on the ladder. And so the hummingbird feeders are rungs, and they're using them. They're overwintering in Alaska now, Anna's hummingbirds at feeders. They're not shy about that. Same thing's happening with Carolina wrens up in Canada. They're really expanding up past Toronto toward Quebec. And they do use feeders, but they'll use other things too. I see a lot of Anna's hummingbirds in riparian. Here's red-shouldered hawks. Oh, they're not at feeders. They're coming up. They might be also expanding upslope in the Sierra, going to higher elevations, which is kind of a equivalent to moving to a higher latitude. Turkey vultures still kind of low in Washington in winter. I'm not sure we have Christmas bird counts in the right places to count turkey vultures, but they're sure taking off in Oregon and British Columbia. They're also taking over the world. Although even in the South, they're not increasing, they're just kind of holding their own. Great egret, eating a meadowlark there. Sorry about that graphic photo, but I just thought it was really interesting. Yeah, they're expanding. The map shows quite the expansion into the interior, and I've seen this on some other species where birds are moving into Nevada or the Columbia River. I haven't quite fully figured out why that is. One thing in the West that's quite different from the East is we do have obstacles like mountains and stuff like that. There's no scrub jays on Vancouver Island. They don't seem to be able to cross the water. For that matter, there's no black-capped chickadees on Vancouver Island. And then north of Vancouver, what's going to happen with some of these species? Anna's hummingbirds have managed to go up the coast. Scrub jays, I don't think they're going to get up the Sunshine Coast very far. Some of these birds are going up inland, but of course it's a lot colder inland. So it's just kind of interesting to see what the topography in the West is going to do. Lesser goldfinches are in Montana now. They're like established in Missoula, Montana, which is kind of crazy, and they're going even farther east. So I think it's incisive or insightful to talk about what birds aren't moving, what resident non-migratory birds that are common, like black phoebes and scrub jays, but they're not going anywhere. And it's Nuttall's woodpecker, oak-tip mouse, California thrasher, California towhee, maybe California towhees will make it to Roseburg and the Willamette Valley, in which case they'll be home free. But so I think the thrasher and the towhee just don't move very far, and they can't get over the mountains very easily. Oak-tip mouse and Nuttall's woodpecker are really dependent on oaks, and oaks don't fly. In fact, they move very, very slowly. So these are birds that the Audubon predictions flagged as high risk, even though they're common right now. They flagged them as high risk species. and it'd be interesting to think of like what other ones there are. There's wren tits that can't cross the river. So they're up on the south side of the Columbia River. In recent years, there's been some up kind of upstream where the river is narrower. These birds typically don't move very far. There is some, well, actually, there's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence in California with the fires that they've moved onto the Sacramento Valley floor into riparian areas where they've never been before. And I've personally witnessed that. So they might be more resourceful than we think. And then there's birds that are already at the top rung of the ladder. These are birds that have, the other term for this is an escalator to extinction, is the term that I've seen in the literature. These are birds that are already on the edge. Ivory gull, black guillemot are Arctic species. Salt marsh sparrow is a salt marsh bird. Salt marshes will typically be inundated by sea level rise, and if they're surrounded by urban infrastructure like railroad tracks or cities, the salt marsh has nowhere to go. And then rosy finches are a high altitude alpine bird. Again, these are all species on the proverbial top rung of the ladder already. Quickly, let's see what time it is. Quickly go through some migrants that are actually doing some changes. They're moving more north. There's a quote: "We conclude that shifting winter climate has allowed basically winter bird assemblages throughout eastern North America are starting to go north a little bit, and that's definitely happening in Washington as well." So here's some data I put together, and this was in the WOS newsletter actually, of Christmas bird counts. This is from major Pacific Northwest CBC. So that was Seattle, Tacoma, no, I think it was Seattle, Olympia, Portland, Bellingham, and Vancouver, Washington. Hermit thrushes are increasing. Cedar waxwings are somewhat increasing. They're pretty erratic species. Lincoln sparrow are increasing. White-crowned sparrow we talked about earlier. That was predicted by Audubon to increase in the winter. They do seem to be. Orange-crowned warblers are still pretty rare in the winter, but they are increasing. And yellow-rump warblers are the poster child for this. On the Port Townsend count, I think our record was 9 in the winter, and then we had 16, and then we had 86 last year. So yeah, those are some winter birds that are increasing. And yes, are birds decreasing in the south? We saw it on some of those trends maps. There's a huge study with multiple papers from the Mojave Desert. Every species is decreasing except for ravens. And the decreases are linked to body size and lack of access to water and high temperatures. So it's kind of a cooling thing. And if you go to Birds and Climate Change Facebook group, there's more papers on this. It's really fascinating study because they're looking at these birds' cooling demands and water demands. So I'm going to go to our last topic, which is the question is, what if a bird's not changing at all? What if everything's fine for this bird? It's well within its range. It can handle temperatures higher or lower. Well, the thing is everything is changing around the bird. So with so many things in motion, it's really hard to predict what's happening. So my favorite paper on this is a story from the mountains of Arizona. And what's happening there is the snow level is, the average snow level is higher. And that's even happening in Washington State. Average snow level is higher, which means now that the elk are browsing at a higher place up the mountain. and they're denuding the understory, which is causing problems for nesting hermit thrushes, green-tailed towhees, and that is orange-crowned warbler. That's the gray-headed orange-crowned warbler. And they're declining because the understory where they nest has been denuded by the elk because they can go up there for the less snow. The juncos kind of like the more open habitat, so the gray-headed juncos are actually increasing. So this is an illustration of how unpredictable things happen. And it's amazing that they were able to document all this. There's some predictions that some regions, in fact, it's from the Nisqually wildlife area, Nisqually Wildlife Refuge, had a prediction of 50% turnover in bird species composition, meaning they're going to lose some, they're going to gain some. So one ecological cascade I'm worried about is people up here in Washington think scrub jays are really beautiful, but let me tell you, I've seen them chase Steller's jays off feeders. They're very sneaky and they're very aggressive, and they eat baby eggs. They're probably chicks too, but they're really good at taking eggs. I'm really worried about what scrub jays are going to do to robins. So keep an eye out for juvenile robins. If you have juvenile robins in your neighborhood, that's a great sign. If you don't, then that could mean there's scrub jays. And don't feed them peanuts. Let them find those Gary Oaks. Wrapping things up here, back to my original theme of letting the listening to the birds, looking at the birds to tell us what's happening in the world. Braiding sweetgrass. Robin Wall Kimmerer has the same message. The land is the real teacher. Henry David Thoreau said very much the same thing. I went to the woods to see if I could not learn what it had to teach. And the role we can play is to continue to document things we see, especially the common birds, and especially fresh juveniles. When you see the juveniles out, make note of that. Henry David Thoreau's notes on bird nesting, he took copious notes, and people are comparing the timing of things he noted when flowers bloomed and when birds started singing to today. And I happened to dig up one of his old eBird reports. This is from Henry David Thoreau in 1846. So yeah, he was very good at documenting things. So with that, we can go to some questions.
Oh, Steve, that was a compelling presentation. It's a pretty sobering story for those of us who enjoy our local birds. And think about what's coming for the birds and for us. And Elaine, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look in the chat and see if there's some questions for Steve.
Thank you, Vicki. The guy is so multi-talented. He looked at things while he was talking and remained cogent. But in this little interval, while people think about questions they might want to pose, feel free to type them into the chat. Could I take a moment to add my thanks to you, Vicki King, for these 3 years of dedication and hard work for, this has got to have been the most challenging time ever for a volunteer. Yes, you are a volunteer to take on this role as WOS monthly meeting program coordinator. It's all about one in the middle of volunteer. You have poured heart, soul, ingenuity, and your special touch into making these meetings possible when we really, really needed them. Deepest thanks.
Well,
And
thank you.
folks, please.
I will say one of the benefits of being a program coordinator, if there are people you want to hear talk, give talks, you're in a position to invite them to come and share their expertise and insights with everyone else. And so I've enjoyed every bit of it. It's been wonderful. And I encourage other people to think about stepping up and doing it.
As folks are typing in their questions that they might have, I'll just mention that we are going to happily have this video into the collection on the YouTube channel, and you can find that by going to WOS. And I'll also put all the links that we were able to gather from Steve in the text that goes with that. But if you roll up on the chat right here, you'll find most of the things that have been mentioned hyperlinked in the meeting chat. Steve, I'm looking at the chat.
Yeah, the chat's great.
Subsidized crows harvest.
Oh, so that means subsidized means fed by humans. So there's actually research that feeding birds in the summer, in the spring and summer, basically May, June, July, August, tends to, you end up feeding crows, jays, house sparrows, cowbirds, which will all cause problems for other nest, especially cup nesters. Well, the cowbirds will go after anything, but there's quite a bit of research that basically they become subsidized predators. So subsidies mean, it's a term that biologists use. Crows and jays that are fed peanuts and stuff at a bird feeder are considered subsidized predators, and they will depress populations of robins and, vireos, tanagers, warblers, flycatchers, etc.
Bush tits.
Yeah. So I try to avoid feeding anything that attracts jays and crows, personally. And generally, it's peanuts is the big thing. So I never feed with peanuts, and I don't feed in the summer. I've stopped my feed as soon as the last golden crown sparrows left. Yeah, peanuts will not divert them. Their appetites are bigger than that. And also, they don't even eat the peanuts. They cache them all for the winter.
Anyone else? Questions?
In fact, speaking of caching food, so a lot of birds take the food from your feeder and they cache it for the winter. Chickadees can remember. What was the study? Chickadees can remember 5,000 places where they hid things.
And they rewire it every season, don't they?
And I can't find my car keys half the time. And chickadees could remember 5,000 car keys where they put them. But yeah, so the jays and crows.
Where it's cold.
But I know jays and crows are hiding those peanuts all around. Yep.
Anyone else?
We are so grateful your internet worked so well. This was wonderful.
I'm relieved.
If I may, feeding peanuts and so on for crows and jays, but feeding much smaller seeds and on hanging bird feeders that are really only accessible to birds that are, the size of chickadees and juncos and so on. Is that really a problem also?
No, in fact, there's quite the opposite. There's research, and we all know it because we see what happens when it snows. That feeding smaller birds helps them get through cold spells, especially in the winter, and can lead to increased survival. So,
but what about feeding them in the summertime?
Sometimes I'll keep up a what do you call it, suet feeder, at my house, the starlings hit it in the summer, and it just makes me mad. So I take it down. There's a lot of food in the summer, and again, a lot of these birds have cached food. So I think the summer is not a biological bottleneck for them. It's more the winter, and especially cold snaps in the winter. There's interesting data, and I have it on a blog post at Cottonwood Post, of Carolina wrens in Canada, which is mostly Ontario, and they're dramatically increasing there with the warmer winters. But the climate change also gives us these polar vortexes, and if the vortex, if the cold spell lasts more than 4 days, these Carolina wrens die off, but then they bounce back the next year. But it's definitely the feeders that are sustaining them. I have so few Anna's hummingbirds on the feeder now. Yeah, well, they're at flowers. They're eating insects. If they're feeding young, they're probably going after insects. I definitely have less hummingbird feeder use at the moment. But they're making use of multiple food sources at the moment.
And for the general good of all, feeding birds seed and so on, we sometimes are concerned we might make them dependent, but that, I mean, aside of maybe these unusual cold spells, that has been roundly disproven. We are not making the birds dependent on putting on the food that we're putting out, the seeds and so on. That's hopefully something Steve will also confirm, but we read studies that have tried to establish.
Yeah, well, it certainly won't stop them from migrating. I mean, so one thing, and we see this with climate change, is the migrants aren't affected by your bird feeder, and they're not even, and unfortunately, they're not affected, like the European pied flycatcher. It flies thousands of miles to find the right food every year as a long distance migrant, but it's hardwired by day length. And so that's why it's only coming 1 day earlier instead of 3 weeks earlier, is because it's hardwired by day length. And that's why it's migrating when it's migrating, and nothing seems to stop it or make it adjust that strongly.
Martha, swans don't eat black oil sunflower seeds. Martha has asked, is it okay to feed only black oil sunflower seeds? Of course. I mean, the chickadees will keep busy and no harm done, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, birds eat different species focus on different seeds, and they focus on different seeds different times of the year. Like I've been told that they don't eat Niger thistle in the winter because something about the protein mix is not right, but they will eat it in the summer. Once, this was in California, but when my son was in junior high, he had to do a science project, and so we bought a wild seabird mix. Obviously, I had influence over this, and we painfully separated, the little white balls, the Milo balls, from the little orange balls, from the cracked corn, from this, and we separated them into piles, and we put them out separately to see which birds were coming to which type of seed. And I learned some stuff from that. Yeah, so you can try that, and you'll be able to give the next talk.
Super.
Oh, bandtail pigeons, send them to my house. I love them.
Well, Steve, this has just been a splendid evening. And if no one else has any additional questions or observations to share, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us.